Okay, so we know how the water gets in, and we know we've just looked at the structure of the leaf, so where the water's heading so that it meets with the carbon dioxide in the palisade cells and in the spongy mesophyll cells. But now we're going to look at how the water actually gets up from the roots up to the leaves to combine with the water. And so the water actually travels inside long tubes called xylem vessels. Now, xylem vessels, when the plant grew, if you think about a whole load of cells, okay, as the plant grew, we didn't need to have like a whole load of cells in a row because we couldn't really transport the water up there because the cell walls were in the way. And so what happens was these walls were broken down by the plant to create a long vessel called a xylem vessel. And it's a long continuous vessel, and it's coated in a substance. For those of you looking for 8s and 9s, it's coated in a substance on the outside called lignin. And lignin is really tough, hard, waterproof material. And because it's so hard, it means that as water moves, these vessels don't collapse in on each other. But because lignin is waterproof and because it is so hard, it means that these cells, which originally were like this is now a dead part of the plant. But it's perfect for transporting water up through the plant. They do have little holes in them. They can be different shaped holes to allow water to move in and out from the roots and out to the leaves at the top. Otherwise, it would just be an impermeable tube. Okay, so now we need to look at how the water actually moves up the stem and through those xylem. And so the process it moves by is called transpiration. And the movement, the water actually moving, is called the transpiration stream. Now, when you have a question about this, it's really easy to think that let's start down by the roots because that's where the water goes in. But actually, with any of these type of questions, you always want to start up at the top of the plant. You want to start in the leaves. So if we look at that leaf that we drew earlier, so I'm just going to draw a few little palisade cells, a few little epidermis cells. There's my waxy cuticle. Here's some spongy mesophyll cells. Not very good drawings, but they will do. Here's my guard cells. Okay, a bit more spongy mesophyll. Okay, and over here, that would be my xylem vessels. Okay, and so what happens is at this point here, the water starts to evaporate, and it evaporates into the air spaces in the spongy mesophyll layer, and that water vapor then leaves through the stomata. It diffuses, okay, from a high to a low concentration. So there's lots of water vapor in the air spaces of the leaf, so it diffuses out through the stomata into the surrounding area around the leaf. And the thing you have to remember here is that this is water vapor. Okay, you have to use the word vapor. It's not actually water, it's not liquid water dripping out, it's water vapor which is diffusing out. And that water vapor has come from this first cell here. And so the water vapor has left this cell. And when it leaves this cell, cell number 1, let's say, cell number 1 now has less water than cell number 2. Because it's lost water into the airspace. So water now moves by osmosis from cell 2 into cell number 1, from high to low, and out of the plant. And you can see that this just carries on. Okay, so we carry on from cell to cell to cell. So now this plant here, this cell here, cell number 3, has got more water than cell number 2. So water moves by osmosis from cell 3 to cell 2. Now cell 4 has got more water than cell 3 because it's just lost some of its water, and so the water moves from 4 to 3. And eventually we get back to the xylem, and so water then moves in from the xylem, again by osmosis, into cell number 4. So you can see that by starting at this point here with the water vapour diffusing out through the stomata, how the water is pulled from cell to cell to cell. Then that means that the water passes up the xylem vessel as one solid rod. So the same thing happens when we get down into the root. And so as the water has shifted up the xylem as its solid rod, then at the bottom we now have lower water down here, or less water down here, and so we then have exactly the same process occurring until we get to our root hair cell at the end, where we have water now high concentration to low concentration, and so the water moves from the cell into the xylem. This one now has a lower concentration than this one, high to low, moves by osmosis. So cell number 5, 6, 7, 8. Number 6 now has less water because water's left it. So water moves from number 7 into number 6. This one now has less water, and so water moves in from number 8, and eventually, here we go, we have water moving in from the soil. And so that process is referred to as transpiration, and that's how we get water moving up through the xylem vessels up to the leaves. So photosynthesis is an endothermic reaction. So that links to your chemistry, and that means that the light energy is taken in the reaction and used to create bonds in the new molecule of glucose. And so that glucose, there's lots of things that happen to that glucose. The first thing that can happen to it is it can be stored in the plant as starch, and starch is a polymer. And again, another link to chemistry here. So if I draw, let's say a glucose molecule looks like this. If I were to look at starch, I would have a chain of those glucose molecules joined together. So that's the definition of a polymer, is a chain of monomer or repeating units. So this is our polymer of starch. The other thing that happens to the glucose, as well as being stored as starch, is that the plant is able to convert it into all the other parts of the plant. So if you think about a plant, it's not just like a lump of sugar, a lump of glucose. It's leaves, it's stem, it's flowers, it's petals, it's bark. It's all these different things, and they all originally start from the initial glucose that's made in photosynthesis. So lipids are fats, they can be stored in plants. Proteins, of course, the plant has to make, and we know that that uses nitrates. So the plant combines or uses parts of the nitrates and joins those with the glucose together to make proteins. It's used to make cellulose. That's the material that the cell wall is made from. But one of the biggest things it's used for is it's used in respiration. Lots of students forget that plants are alive, and so they therefore also undertake respiration. So exactly the same as us, they take the glucose that they made in photosynthesis, they join that with oxygen to make energy to carry out all the reactions in the plant, and they make the waste products of water and of carbon dioxide, same as us. So you have to know what actually happens to, or how this glucose can pass up and down the plant from the root to the roots and to the stem and all the way around the plant to the places that it's needed. And it travels by a process called translocation. And it doesn't travel as glucose, it travels as a substance called sucrose, which is a different type of sugar. Okay, so sucrose is the sugar that is transported up and down the stem, from the leaves to the roots, from the roots back up again. Okay, and it travels in the part of the cell called the phloem tissue. Now, phloem is a tissue because it is actually made of two different types of cells that work together, and those two cells are sieve tube elements and companion cells. So sieve tube elements and companion cells together make up phloem tissue. So if we look what they look like, they're a bit like our xylem in that they're long tubes. But in this instance, the tubes are not completely broken down, or the cells between each other are not completely broken down. In the xylem, remember I said that they broke down completely, so they were just long tubes. In sieve tube elements, this is the sieve tube element, the wall is still there, but it's got lots and lots of little holes between each of the cells. So it is still like a long tube, but this got this holy region between each of the cells. And if you look at it end on, it looks a bit like this. So it does actually look a bit like a sieve. And then next door to these, we've got these other cells called companion cells. So these would be the companion cells alongside. Now the companion cells have got a nucleus inside them. The sieve tube elements don't actually have a nucleus, but they do have cytoplasm running around or running down the sides of the sieve tube element. And there are little tiny kind of channels between the companion cells and the sieve tube element. So here we've got little channels, which means that materials can flow from the companion cell into the sieve tube element and back again. So these are the companion cells. And that's exactly what happens in translocation. So when that glucose is moved, these companion cells will actively pump sucrose in or out of the sieve tube element. So they could pump sucrose from this cell in, or they could pump sucrose from the sieve tube element into the companion cell. Okay, so sucrose is pumped in or out of the sieve tube element by the companion cell. And because we've got lots of pumping going on here, that tells us that this process needs energy. So if we were to look in those cells, then of course, as I said before, we would find lots of mitochondria in those cells, which is where we are generating that energy that is therefore used to either pump sucrose into the sieve tube element or out of the sieve tube element. Once the sucrose is pumped in or pumped out, it changes the pressure in this area here, and it is the pressure change that causes the sucrose to either flow down or up the sieve tube element. So sucrose can flow up and down the sieve tube element, but with Xylem vessels, water was only able to flow up.